Everyone, it's Lucas. First off, we've got The Darkness Comes Before by R. Scott Baker. This was released in 2003 and is book number 1 of the Prince of Nothing trilogy. This would go on to have another series called The Aspect Emperor, which was also 4 books. So overall, it's a 7-book series called The Second Apocalypse. This is dark fantasy and takes place in a world that was ravaged by a first apocalypse a couple thousand years ago. And we follow a group of people which going in, you only have to assume at some point there's going to be another apocalypse. It's dark. It's the main thing that people kind of bring up when people talk about this series is just how dark and pessimistic it is. And as somebody that really enjoys dark fantasy myself, I kind of knew going in that this was going to be something that I enjoyed. I kind of want to touch on the characters that are in the story because I think that's the main thing that I liked about the story was just getting to meet all these different characters and kind of find their roles within the world that would kind of develop what is actually going on. First off, you got Annis Rimber-Kellis, he's kind of just a type of person that was like bred and trained to essentially be better than everybody else, for lack of a better way of putting it. He's kind of the main character of the story, but he's also the character that we know the least about, which is interesting. He's got his POVs, and the story's not told in like a first person perspective where you get inside the heads of what's going on, but you do get some kind of internal thoughts throughout in the third person perspective that's going on. But with Kellis, you don't really see much of what's going on, and the only real time you hear about his motives is from other people, which I think is an interesting way of framing the story. Next off, you got Drusus Acamian. He's kind of just a sad boy sorcerer. Sorcery in this story is really interesting to learn about the magic systems. There isn't a lot of the actual magic being shown, but the way that their organizations are structured and kind of like how each sorcery school has a different mission purpose, I thought was a really interesting way of selling it. You've got Esmenet, who's a prostitute, probably knows more or is more competent than most of the other characters in the story are willing to give her credit for, but she's also extremely dedicated to her job. You've got Nair Erskiotha. This is when you start getting into the point where a lot of character names are a little difficult to pronounce. The kind of barbarian, but really kind of flips the stereotype on its head with the things that he's got going on about him. You got Emperor Zarius III, Emperor of the Nancer Empire, and also just a mother's boy to the maximum extent. And then finally, you got Comphis, who's just this kind of like prodigy military general guy, nephew of the emperor, but somehow with all the other characters still manages to be the biggest narcissist in the story, which I think is an impressive feat to accomplish. Now, I love books with extremely bleak settings, and this is one of those kinds of books where there really isn't a lot of positive things to look forward to. What I think is different about this story is just how nihilistic the outlook is. I think when I read something like First Law, a lot of bad things happen to the characters, but there's always kind of that hope that kills that lingers around where it could always get better for some of these characters. There's always like that positive outlook. There's always that potential for something good to happen that Joe Abercrombie really likes to kind of like slip from underneath your fingers with the whole like got you a dollar meme. This is a little bit different and a bit darker than that. It's really kind of like which of these bad situations do you want to have happen? And one of them's worse, so there's always something to root for. But you never feel like these characters, if they were to succeed in their whole mission, it's not going to be good for somebody else. And it's just a very bleak outlook that Baker really kind of wanted to write about. I think part of that is just wanting to flip a lot of tropes about traditional fantasy on its head. We all know there's these standard like fantasy stories where there's a big bad evil going on, and then there's, you know, your group of heroes that have to overturn it. Baker's a lot more interested in still having the big bad, maybe, potential, but he's not so much about having the heroes be good people within the story. Honestly, being people where you're kind of a little confused about what their motivations are, and he kind of likes to keep that hidden in his sleeve a little bit. So this touches on some things such as just the abuse of power that rulers or the upper class have and how they use it to the disadvantage of the people below them without regard for their life. He also talks about how humans are just kind of bound to this cycle of making mistakes and not learning from the past and what our history has taught us. And there's also some touch some touches of the whole free will versus determinism argument that is related to actually the title of the story. There's a part in the book where he talks about it a little bit more. And I can tell based on some of the characters in this story and the outlook of how this series is going, I have a pretty good feeling about how Baker feels about this whole topic. And I can definitely see it being a bigger thematic aspect later on in the series. To touch on the writing, I think this book, from what I've seen, has a pretty positive reception for a first novel in terms of the quality of the writing. And I have to agree, it's pretty good. I did notice for myself, I went in expecting this to be dark, and I'm kind of selling it as being really dark. And it is. This book especially has some humor in it, which I found to be a little at odds with what was going on. And again, not to relate everything to First Law, but Joe Abercrombie's also a big fan of kind of putting humor in these situations where terrible things are happening. I found with the way that this story is and just the tone and atmosphere of what's going on, I found some of the humor to be a bit odd, and oddly, I would say maybe a little bit juvenile. I still enjoyed it. Don't get me wrong. I like this book quite a bit, but it was an odd thing that I noticed that I just wanted to kind of touch on as being something of note, especially as I go on. Another thing to note is this is definitely a book one of a trilogy, at least. A lot of this book is kind of set up for what's going on later on. It has a phenomenal prologue, one of the best prologues I've ever read. Really sells you into the story, gets you invested in what's going on. And then it kind of takes a step back, introduces some more characters, introduces the political factions, of which, there's a big appendix in the back of the book to help keep track of who exactly is part of what organization and what exactly their intent is. I found it to be pretty engaging. I enjoyed reading it. I was never really bored throughout, but I can see why somebody would be a little frustrated with the lack of stuff going on at sometimes. Overall, I'd give it a 4 out of 5. It's a book that I would say I liked a lot. I finished it a little over a month ago. I started The Warrior Prophet, got about 50 to 100 pages in, and just kind of decided I wanted to read something else. I know I'll like this series. It just seems like the kind of thing that's something I would enjoy quite a bit. But I'm not fully invested at this point. So good book. I'd recommend it if it sounds like something that you're into. Let's get into something darker. The Color Purple by Alice Walker. So this was published back in 1982, follows a young African-American girl in the epistolary format, actually, where she's writing letters and you're reading about growing up in a southern rural town in the early 20th century. So this is a very dark and uncompromising book, even from page 1. Follows her as she's kind of growing up and finding herself in a time that's pre-civil rights movement. So before that is going on, when there's a lot of systematic oppression going on in America. It's different than what you'd expect. It's different from what I expected going in, because when you hear a lot of stories about that, you hear about the oppression that white people or people of races other than African American or other than black were committing in those times. But a lot of the oppression that's happening in this story is actually from her own family. It's a very personal take, because we're reading the letters of somebody that is going through horrible things, but you can tell just doesn't know that life can be any better. So it's a very sad situation of just kind of following this character in their life as they go through all these hardships, and just knowing ourselves that a lot of the stuff that they're going through is unnecessary and just really unfortunate to read about. And that's what I think makes it such a powerful read. Is this is different from most coming of age stories where you follow a kid that might have some kind of hardship within their family, maybe an abusive parent, and they kind of learn to be an adult. This is this is worse than that. This is like a step below, where you're following a person that their family is just completely dysfunctional, and you're kind of just watching a person learning to be their own individual and, like, frankly, just be a person in society. Following Nettie as she just learns to act in her own interests and just become an autonomous human being. This is a heavy read, but it's also a very beautiful read in a lot of ways. You've got themes following repression, oppression, as I've talked about. You've got a lot of good stuff going on about female solidarity. This is one of the best novels I've read that talks about the connections that women have with each other. Not something that I notice in my everyday life personally. You got some really touching stuff talking about love and self-discovery. So I started this book about a month ago, and I remember it was a weekend night, and I heard about this story. I think I saw that I got it on an Audible sale like a year ago. And I just saw it. I was like, I've always been interested in the story. I don't really know anything about it. I just know it's a classic. And kind of just wanted to start a couple chapters out. And what I noticed is I was just hooked on it because it's got that epistolary format. It's told through letters. So it kind of seems a lot like short chapters in the way I'm reading it. And it was just that kind of like one more chapter mentality where it's like, oh, I want to read this. And the story, like what's going on in her life it's really sad, but it's also extremely engaging to read about because it's so different from pretty much everything that I've read before that I just was curious to see what would happen next. What I found out was I never really lost that feeling throughout the story. I read about half the book in a single sitting. It's pretty short. It's like an 8-hour audiobook. So I read it for like an hour and a half at that point. And then the next morning, I just picked it up and finished it. I think that's pretty high praise because I tend not to be a high volume reader a lot of times. I don't read or I don't binge read books a lot. And this is one of the few books that I can recall in recent memory where I pretty much binge through the entire thing without even thinking about switching to another book. And I'm not the only person that feels this way. This is a pretty popular book. I think it won the Pulitzer and the National Book Award for Fiction back in 1983. And it also has like 720,000 Goodreads ratings. I know about the Steven Spielberg adaptation that he would make a couple years later. It was nominated for like 11 Oscars. It's a pretty popular movie. I still need to see it. Whoopi Goldberg plays the main character, which I've seen some Whoopi Goldberg movies. She's a great actress. Phenomenal casting for the main character in the story. It's pretty much exactly who I would imagine if I had to cast somebody myself. And then it would eventually go on to be adapted as a Broadway musical, which also had its own film adaptation a couple of years ago, which, as somebody that generally follows the film industry a little bit, this was actually a pretty high budget musical that came out, and I don't even remember hearing anything about it. It bombed at the box office, so I'm not the only one that hasn't really heard about it. Definitely interesting. So going back to the audiobook itself, it's narrated by Alice Walker, who's the author. I thought she did a phenomenal job. The audiobook, definitely recommend reading it. This is going to be a contender for one of my favorite books of the year. I loved it. I'd give it, it's a 5 out of 5 for me. It's an easy recommendation. It's not a long read either. One of the best books that I've read recently. Finally, we've got The Lost. This is by Jack Ketchum. This was released in 2001, and it's a horror thriller, mainly a thriller. And it follows a group of characters. One of them commits a homicide on a trip and the others witness him. And it kind of takes place a couple years after this trip. And it follows just kind of the aftermath of what's happening as well as, you know, what could potentially happen later on. I'm a big Jack Ketchum fan. I've read 5 of his books now. I've enjoyed all of them. I like the kind of stories that he writes. He's the kind of horror author for me where I read, you know, the basic plot summary and I'm like, that sounds interesting. I'll get into that. At this point, he's got a fairly short catalog. He only wrote like 10 to 12 books, and I've kind of just made it a personal goal that I think I'd like to read all of his stuff if I can get to it. Going back to, you know, the story, there's a lot of perspectives in this book, but the main one of interest is the villain. I think that's kind of what makes horror a special genre compared to a lot of the other genres. Is a lot of these other stories, you have antagonists sometimes, but you want to follow the protagonist. You want to learn more about them. And in a lot of those stories, the antagonist is kind of just a foil for the protagonist. I think horror is really interesting because you can get both perspectives, and some books, some stories, including this one, you find yourself more invested and spending more time with the antagonist than any of the other characters. So he's kind of like the centerpiece of the story, and he really has to work in order for you to really appreciate the story. So the way that the book's framed, and it's kind of like why I mentioned what it's about, I maybe spoiled something, but it's not really a spoiler because it happens in the very first chapter, is that you see early on what this character's capable of. And he's like this deeply disturbing, charismatic psychopath. Pretty standard, I'd say, for what a lot of these kind of characters tend to be like. But you see what he's capable of, and then the rest of the story is kind of just building tension and waiting for a climax of like what's actually going to happen at the end of the story. So when you have a supernatural villain, I've noticed for myself, the things that I really tend to care about is like the creative aspect of what the monster or the villain is like, and then kind of the threat that they pose. So we'll say use some examples. Some of my favorite movies of all time are horror movies of all time are The Thing and Return of the Living Dead. And I think those are two interesting examples to use because they've got plot lines where I put myself into the kind of the shoes of the characters themselves. And I think to myself, wow, that would be a really terrifying situation to be a part of. And you're kind of, I'm at a loss for like how I would deal with the situation any differently. I think The Thing, I'll get back to the story, but I think this kind of has some relation to it. I think The Thing's a special story because the characters are smart, which is not a common thing. I think it's pretty common to watch a horror movie and you do the whole Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen and like yelling at it, and you just think like the whole like, no, don't go in there, like, or you know, when the gang's like, let's split up, gang, and you're like, why are you splitting up to go search this? So this story isn't supernatural, which means instead of like creature design mattering to me, one of the things that I think you kind of have to substitute with like a human villain is you have to make him a person, and you kind of have to ground him in that reality of like this, I can believe like this is a real human being, while at the same time making them like a threat and making me still feel like they're kind of like, you know, scary. And I think that's a difficult limitation to work with in a non-supernatural horror, because when you have vampires and you have zombies, you can have characters make bad decisions, and it's easier for me to wave it off and be like, well, they're dealing with things that they've never seen before. Characters are making like weird decisions. I don't know how, you know, vampires make decisions, so they can pretty much do whatever they want, and I'll be like, yep, that's what a vampire would do. But with a human character, when you have like a person, even if they're like a psychopath, it still makes it a little bit difficult for me to be more I'm just tend to be more critical of the decisions that villains would make, but I also tend to be a little bit more critical of how they're portrayed, how the people themselves are portrayed. And if other people are acting around the villain, it tends to make me a little more conscious about why people are making the decisions that they're making. And this is one of those stories where it's very obvious that like the villain is a terrible human being. And he's got that like charisma that tends to draw people to him. But I think one of the limits that I had with this story was I just didn't buy that people would trust this human being or be willing to put themselves in a situation to be personal with him in a, you know, in a like closed setting essentially. And I get it. Like, it's easy for me to say I've never been, you know, murdered. So it's easy for other people to be like, well, people still get murdered, put themselves in situations where bad things happen to them. And it's normal for a horror story to, you know, have those characters that put themselves in bad things happening because that's how the horror happens. But I would say as a character in general, I just found his character to be a bit bizarre at times, and it just kind of took me out of the story a little bit, and it made it a little less believable for me. So where I think something like The Girl Next Door or Off Season ranged from like a really good kind of like pulp horror story that I enjoyed to like being horror classic level, this didn't quite get on the same level as that. This is like a solid 3 out of 5 for me. I'm obviously going to keep reading Jack Ketchum's stuff, but I would be lying if I said this wasn't a little bit of a disappointment. I thought the climax of the story was satisfying and it was enjoyable. When you start reading an author more often, you tend to like the shock value, especially in horror, of things that happen early on tend to wear a little bit thin when it's like the third or fourth or even, you know, whatever amount of time that they've pulled like the same trick out of their hat. And you're just like, okay, I wish you kind of get to something different, but still a worthy read. I think if you're like a thriller fan and like the whole like psychopath character that is like the main villain is I don't know a lot of books that kind of follow this plot setting. I think it's in movies you see it a little bit, but if that sounds like something of interest to you, then I'd say sure, try it out, but definitely not going to sell it super hard. I also read Different Seasons by Stephen King. I'm not going to talk about that here. I'll probably make its own video for it, but just know that I thought it was an incredible book. Currently reading Red Country, last of the first Lost standalone, and going through book number 2 of Dungeon Crawler Carl right now. I also started The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett. Everybody recommends that you start with one of the more popular books, but I was holding out the hope that I'd just read it and be like a mega fan and then be like, awesome, I can just go through like all 41 Discworld books. It's a little bit slow going. Not my favorite book so far, but I'll probably finish it. So I'll talk to you guys later. See you.